Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sunder Katwala. I'm the Director of British Future. Welcome to this event, Barriers to Britishness. This is the launch of the independent inquiry into the future of citizenship policy that's been chaired by Alberto Costa MP, who joins us today to discuss the findings of the inquiry, and we'll have responses from Ryan Shorthouse of Bright Blue, from Dr. Alexandra Bulat of the 3 Million as well, to discuss this important but neglected theme of citizenship policy. British Future has been acting as a secretariat for this inquiry. My colleague Jill Rutter, who has been central to that, will also be presenting the findings to us. A few acknowledgements and thank yous. At the start, we'd like to thank all of the inquiry members and panelists, because they've worked hard to find a consensus on this issue. All of those of you, many of you here today, who've given evidence for us or helped us with our citizen engagement that took place in Sheffield, in Southampton and in Edinburgh, and with your expertise and advice. We'd also like to thank the Paul Hamlin Foundation and MoneyGram for supporting the work of British Future in supporting this, this process and this inquiry. We have a hashtag today, hashtag Barriers to Britishness, if you'd like to talk about the event. And at British Future, you can pick up the report itself, some video and film footage of it. And this event is also being streamed on YouTube, and so a link will be available afterwards. So that's all of the formalities. The reason British Future set up this inquiry is that citizenship is a very important issue. It's not an issue that's had the attention that it deserves. We think it's an area where people can find the common ground. I'd like to hand over to Alberto Costa, who chaired the inquiry, to tell us both why the issue matters and what we found.
Well, thank you, Sunder, for that introduction. And could I firstly add my sincere thanks to you and to everyone in the British Future team for having thought up about this inquiry, for having invited me to chair the inquiry, and having worked closely with my team and the panelists of the inquiry to produce what I consider, if you don't mind me saying, is frankly an excellent report. And a special thanks go to Jill Rutter for the research and dedication and time that she's put into drafting and helping me and the team with this important report. And why did I accept chairing this inquiry? Well, it goes without saying that British Future are a very valued, respected, independent think tank. And when you, Sunder, and Jill approached me and discussed the matter with me, I thought that over the last 5 or so years that I've been a Member of Parliament, there's been understandably a very heavy focus on immigration and immigration policy, immigration process. Should we have full control of who we let into our country, so on and so forth. But there was next to no discussion in the House of Commons on the issue of citizenship, which of course is quite distinct from the issue of immigration. Citizenship, of course, is about what are the rights and responsibilities that we as a society take on board when we become citizens. And insofar as this report is concerned, what are the policies that we would like to see when we want to encourage those that have given so much to our country through their acceptance of British values, through their working in the United Kingdom, through their payment of taxation, through their studying, in whichever means that they've come to make Britain home. How do we want immigrants to fully acquire the same rights and responsibilities that British citizens have? And at the moment, or indeed over the last 40 years, successive Labour and Conservative governments have frankly neglected this area. It's almost been a side issue that you acquire the right to naturalise the process by which most people become British when they come into this country. You acquire that right after, in most instances, a period of years of working and living in the country. But the right itself, when exercised, there's no fanfare to it. There's no state or civil society welcoming approach to it. For example, the ceremonies that are held in municipal offices are often very low-key affairs where an individual merely goes through the process of attending the ceremony as part of the process rather than as something to be celebrated, something to be enjoyed, and something to be welcomed, not just by the applicant who naturalises and becomes British, but indeed by civil society, by businesses, by schools and school children, by charities, by all the sort of individuals that play an important part in society. And what we're saying in this report is that we should really beef up what it means to become a British citizen, have a much more generous, open approach to the acquisition of British citizenship, and let it be something that, and I think we can use the word justifiably, something that's patriotic, and patriotic in the sense that we all celebrate an individual who's made and who's chosen Britain as their home and who becomes British. It's something to be welcomed, something to be cherished, something to be enjoyed. And I think that's what I certainly mean by patriotism. It's not some jingoistic flag waving, but something that we can genuinely say, this is what it means to be British. So it's been an honour, Sunder, to have chaired this inquiry. I'm very grateful for all the work that the respective teams have done, and I look forward to this afternoon's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alberto. A strong statement there of the value of unjingoistic flag waving, which is very good to have. Jill Rutter led the research and the secretariat for the inquiry and is now going to present to us the key findings of the inquiry panel.
Hopefully you can hear me and see the screen. Alberto has already kind of mentioned the aims of the inquiry. We wanted to consider what the aims of citizenship policy should be, investigate the application of citizenship law, but importantly kind of foster much greater debate on citizenship. As well as the inquiry panel sittings and an open call for evidence, we consulted quite a lot of people, civil society, and at a community event in Sheffield. We also brought together two groups of new citizens and with British citizens by birth in Edinburgh and Southampton, and we filmed their discussions, and we'll show you a short film about that at the end. So we're very, very grateful for the evidence that we had from quite a lot of very varied organisations, universities, councils, business and civil society. So what did the inquiry consider and what are its recommendations? So absolutely core to the inquiry, it was what is citizenship and what should policy aim to achieve? The inquiry's view is that citizenship affords responsibilities and rights, but is also a common bond. And citizenship policy, therefore, should have two aims: to make these rights and duties meaningful and to strengthen British citizenship as a social glue, as a social bond. The inquiry also recommended that citizenship should be seen as a positive decision, which the government wants to welcome and encourage. And it recommended that the government set up an independent advisory group on citizenship, which should engage the public, new citizens, prospective citizens, but the broader public. Another key question were the eligibility criteria for citizenship. And we recommended amending nationality law to allow children born in the UK to become British citizens automatically. That would vastly simplify law and it would give a more rapid route to integration to children who are already here and are likely to remain here in the long term. The inquiry also looked at the application process. Was that a barrier? And costs were evidently a huge barrier. Britain has the most expensive route to citizenship of any developed country. So the inquiry recommended a review of fee policy, and it recommended that citizenship by registration should be free. That would make citizenship free for children, but also other vulnerable groups, such as stateless people and some of the subsidiary categories of British nationality. Another key recommendation was that the application process should be simplified. So it should be something that people can complete themselves without the need to pay legal fees. So it should be very simple. The inquiry looked at the Life in the UK test and the English language requirements. The government's already committed to reviewing the Life in the UK test, but hasn't taken forward those proposals. So the inquiry recommended a review of its content, and crucially, the handbook should send out a message of welcome to those who've decided to apply for British citizenship. Interesting to compare our citizenship handbook with the Canadian handbook. The Canadian handbook starts on page 1 with a picture of the Queen and a strong message of welcome. Britain's Life in the UK handbook has no such message, and the Queen makes a rather belated appearance on page 121. People pay for courses. They swat up on the questions. They do lots of practice questions. So to make the process more meaningful, we recommended piloting a citizenship course where applicants studied alongside British sixth formers. What you want a new citizen to know, we thought was quite similar to the knowledge that somebody leaving school should have about British history, about the duties and responsibilities of citizens, about life in the UK. Why not let the two groups study together? And we recommended keeping the language requirements as they are, but setting up a Learning English Freeview channel, which would carry content applicable to the citizenship as well. And the inquiry looked at our citizenship ceremonies, recommending that they needed to be made more special and not hidden away from the rest of society. So the inquiry recommended holding them at iconic locations and involving local residents. A few registrars have done that already. It also recommended an annual citizenship ceremony attended by the Queen and the Prime Minister, where citizenship was granted to people who had made an exceptional contribution to life in the UK, whether they were key workers, for example, or scientists or NHS workers involved in the COVID response. Information about volunteering and voter registration should be given out at the ceremonies to encourage civic participation. And the inquiry also recommended presenting people with their first passport at the ceremony. Lastly, the inquiry looked at some international issues, because citizenship doesn't confine itself to the borders of the UK. It recommended upholding the commitment to give British citizenship to current British overseas territory citizens, commitment that the government has made but not acted on. It recommended more action on supporting stateless people in the UK, but also working to address the root causes of statelessness abroad. And last but not least, the inquiry recommended putting in place a strategy to engage the British diaspora overseas. 5.4 million Brits live abroad. They are largely an asset to the UK, and we could do much more in engaging them and harnessing their goodwill and influence. So that's the recommendations in a nutshell.
Thank you, Jill. So we'll head into the discussion now. We're hoping to hear questions from you, which you'll have to put in the Q&A if you're in the audience here today, and I will put some of those questions to the panel when we've heard from them. So what we want to discuss this afternoon is what are the priorities for reform in citizenship? If we're going to have a proactive approach, what are the most important barriers to remove? So we'd like to hear about that, but also, can we make change happen now? Can we get these policies adopted by this government across the political parties? What can all of us interested in this issue, in civic society, in politics, and faith, in other areas as citizens, do to put this agenda on the map in a way perhaps it hasn't been? So we'll hear from Alex and Ryan. Dr. Alexandra Bulat came to this country to study, but has stayed here, has campaigned energetically for the rights of EU nationals, but importantly is one of the newest British citizens in our country at this phase where that has been frozen for a while, obviously with the pandemic. So welcome, Alex, as a new British citizen. Tell us how we can make this process work better for everyone.
Thank you very much, Sunder, and thank you for inviting me to this very important discussion on a very positive and, I would say, much needed report on citizenship policy. I would like to share today some thoughts as someone who has lived experience of migration and who is also a new British citizen, as you mentioned, because in many ways it is this personal lived experience that shapes many of our visions for a more accessible and inclusive citizenship policy in the UK, whether it's our own personal lived experience, such as in my case, or our parents or our families. I first lived in the UK actually when I was about 3 years old, just for a few months, because my dad had a short-term NHS contract at the time in Skipton in Yorkshire for a few months. But unfortunately, our family had to leave the UK. Romania was not in the EU at the time. It was more complicated with different visa requirements. But those early experiences of myself at 3 years old living in the UK matter a lot, because those are my earliest memories of leaving the nursery on a rainy day in 1997 and telling the other kids there, I will come back in the autumn, I'll come back in the autumn. And I was actually back in the autumn, but I was back in the autumn 15 years later when I turned 18 and I could come here to study in the UK. To be honest, for the first few months of being in the UK, I really struggled understanding what my flatmates were saying in English. I really struggled with life in the UK, that we'll discuss a bit later, I'm sure, about this. But 8 years later, in 2020, so this year, I finished my PhD degree, since the doctor title here, and I also received this brand new passport, and I'll let you decide whether it's blue or black. That's a question for debate, perhaps, for the chat. But what I want to say today is this pathway to citizenship was not the most straightforward. And I'll always actually remember getting a rejection email from the Home Office on my 24th birthday in 2018 when I applied for the old permanent residency card under the system before we had the EU settlement scheme. Now, of course, later on, I did get settled status, so it was all fine for the pathway for citizenship, but I do remember those negative feelings I had on the day and how I felt the system was deeply unfair for many people in the UK. And when I got to this naturalization stage to apply for citizenship, even as someone who studied and worked on immigration policy in my work in the 3 million, I still needed to double check some of the requirements with a citizenship advisor. And COVID, as we all know, the pandemic made this process more difficult, many delays in the process, including delays to the citizenship ceremonies that I was looking forward to and I had earlier this autumn. Many young people like me want to follow the same pathway to citizenship, but there are many barriers in this way, and many of those barriers are highlighted in your report today. And what we have been missing so far, I think my main reflection on this is we have been missing a positive vision on citizenship in the UK. For starters, on the barrier, the application fee for naturalization, most people go through naturalization, £1,330. That's something, to be honest, most of my friends simply cannot afford. So I do recognize I'm, very privileged to be able to save, well, slowly, but save this amount of money over the years in the UK. And the fee, as I think it's very important to highlight this, that it's much higher than in comparable Western developed countries like the United States and Australia, and also that it only costs the Home Office £372 to process an application, which is important to keep in mind when we think about what should a fair price be for the citizenship application. But what's most disheartening for me really is that the current citizenship process is unfair to families. For a family of 4 EU citizens, if you think about this, it's more than £5,000 for everyone to apply for citizenship. And this can go up to almost and even over £15,000 for a similar family of non-EU citizens. So further dividing between non-EU and EU citizens and making this process even more unfair, because non-EU citizens obviously have to pay for a very expensive indefinite leave to remain route as well before even thinking about applying for citizenship. So many people are prevented from applying because of those requirements that are hard to find and even harder to understand to the general public. Based on my own experience and also the experience of others that I listen to on a weekly basis, people, EU citizens who go through the citizenship process like I did, those experiences really inspire me to campaign on a more accessible pathway for citizenship in the UK. And that's one of the key campaigns actually at the moment in the 3 Million. We're an organization campaigning for EU migrants' rights in the UK. And one of the key campaigns in the Young Europeans group that I co-chair at the 3 Million is called Global Brits, which is precisely about highlighting some of the recommendations made today in the report, particularly around reviewing the cost and really underlining this idea that a global Britain, if we want to build a global Britain, global Britain needs global Brits, and that 2021 is actually a huge opportunity for the current government to develop more positive policies around this long neglected area of citizenship. Overall, we see a British public who are positive on citizenship in the report as well, which is very encouraging. And in many policy areas, such as on child citizenship, the public is actually much more positive than the current policies suggest. So the question is, why not make the pathway to citizenship more in line actually with British public opinion on this issue? And why not have a citizenship policy that actually meaningfully reflects the positive public views and also migrants' lived experiences as well? Well, I will end with this, the main question, which is addressed to the panel and the inquiry more broadly, and the hashtag for today, which is, how can we remove the barriers to Britishness? And I think the answer is very simple to this. We remove those barriers to Britishness by actually having collectively the political will to implement the more positive vision on citizenship that all of us here today want to see. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Alex. And so, Ryan, this inquiry has said we could have some consensus here. There's a real breadth of potential opinion, but it's a big challenge in times like this to cross the political divides and to make change happen. How do you think we can do that?
Great, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you for an excellent report and everyone involved in it, including Alberto and Sunder, but particularly to Jill, because it's a very detailed report with lots of very practical, sensible, detailed ideas. So whether it's, you can bring 5 guests rather than 2, looking at the kind of SOPRIS area document uploading service, it's very detailed, and it's just the sort of policy work that is difficult to do, but also very much needed. So on to the point about consensus, I think this idea of civic nationalism, to which citizenship is perhaps the sort of best emblem of, is something which should unite people across the political spectrum, conservatives, socialists, and liberals. For conservatives, the nation state is about sort of bringing up things around duty, around interdependence, things that they want to foster in society, a sort of pride in the nation state, I think, is help facilitate that. For socialists, I think pride in the nation state can bring about greater solidarity, which is helpful, for example, for increased support for redistribution for people who are more disadvantaged. And for liberals, I think this is trickier terrain, kind of belief in the nation state and nationalism has always been something which has been problematic. And there's a great essay in Prospect magazine this month by Timothy Garton-Ash where he looks at the relationship between liberalism and the nation state, and I really recommend it. But for me, I think it can, pride in the nation state and this concept of civic nationalism, I think liberals can get behind for two reasons. One, it kind of stops the descent into kind of individualism, into a divisive identity politics. If there's something greater than our kind of social identities, the nation state, which unites us. And the second is, I suppose you kind of build a cultural, political, legal system, which is, is based on civic values rather than communalist or religious principles, which can obviously trump individual liberty and rights. So in my mind, I think there's a great cross-party space to really push this idea of an inclusive civic nationalism and nation state. And the biggest emblem of that is really citizenship policy and showing that we want more people who come to this country to adopt British citizenship, and we should be proud of that, and they should be proud of that. And it's really sort of rescuing and I think being more positive about citizenship policy and creating a better and more inclusive citizenship policy is a way of rescuing the nation state and nationalism away from the kind of ethno-nationalists on the far right. And I think citizenship policy is an important way of doing this. So based on that, I think it is concerning over the last decade that the government has actually tried to make citizenship harder by increasing the fees gradually year on year in a way which is profiteering. The evidence seems to suggest that citizenship has both benefits for the individual who becomes a citizen, but also for wider society. Those people who become citizens, increased civic engagement, greater sense of belonging, and enhanced employment opportunities. So good for them, good for the rest of society. So I think, and I would say that's based on both domestic and international evidence. Sometimes the evidence is stronger in countries where there is a more acute difference between the rights and responsibilities of people who have got permanent settlement and citizenship. I don't think that's particularly that acute in the UK. There's a question of whether it could be, but nonetheless, there are those positive benefits, to some extent, which comes through in the UK evidence. So, in my view, there's definitely a need to look at the biggest barrier, which is the fee, which lots of evidence seems to suggest is putting off people from becoming citizens. And we did a recent report, which I think is very complementary to the work that British Future have done today, which looks at public attitudes, which Alexandra just mentioned, towards citizenship policy. And key findings are that clear majority of the British public think it's important for immigrants living permanently in the UK to become citizens. UK public more likely to believe that the current cost to an applicant of applying for citizenship is too high rather than about right or too low. And the public are particularly, a majority of the public are particularly supportive of reducing the fees for migrants, particularly working in key sectors like the NHS, social care, and also to make the journey a lot more streamlined and quicker for those people as well. There's majority support for that. Also, I noticed the inquiry recommended bringing back birthright citizenship, which is obviously a policy which was in place before the 80s for children who are born here to give an automatic right to citizenship. The public are supportive of that, a majority of the public do support that as well. So interestingly, in terms of that majority support, it tends to be across different divides, both socially and politically. So yes, Conservative voters and Leave voters are less likely to be positive about some of the things that I've talked about, but still a majority of those voters support some of the reforms, particularly on making it cheaper and quicker for certain groups. So Bright Blue, when we published our report, talked about, for example, kind of for COVID key workers, about 1 million foreign workers, kind of scrapping the citizenship fees that they are charged, reducing the residency requirement, which is 5 years to 2 years, to make it much quicker for those people, and reducing the fee for residency for permanent settlement, which comes just before you apply for citizenship, at least a year later, and reducing that by at least 75%. So we would recommend those, along with most of the other stuff that's in the very good British Future report. So I think you're right. It's a policy agenda which hasn't really got the attention, I think, that it warrants, because I think it can be very uniting, particularly in quite a divisive post-Brexit environment that we're in at the moment. So I hope we can push this even further amongst Conservative government ministers and policymakers.
Thank you, Ryan, for that. So we've got lots of questions out there for the panel. Some of them are detailed questions of policy. Some of these are more political questions. I think I'll start with one of the latter and get Alberto's view first on this. Nicholas Hatton asks this. He says, I see this pathway to citizenship as a key issue when the dust of Brexit finally settles, 2021, and the inquiry's recommendations are welcome, raising awareness, promoting positive reform. His question is there realistically a window for a political opportunity to reform the pathway to citizens between now and the end of this Parliament in 2024? So Alberto, can we get this political space open now? How would that work?
Well, thank you, Sunder, and thank you to Nicholas for the question, and indeed for the excellent work that he and his colleagues do at the 3 Million, a very valued organisation. I think, Nicholas, the answer is, well, I'm the sort of chap that sees a glass half full. There's always a political opportunity. The question is how, where's the momentum going to be built? And I think today we're really kick-starting this policy. But we need people like yourself and organisations like the 3 Million to help push this policy among policymakers, among other stakeholders, and ultimately among politicians. I'll be doing my part to speak to government colleagues, to demonstrate to government colleagues that this is something that can be very much part of the Conservative government's Global Britain agenda. If we're going out there to promote Britain, and we're controlling immigration, and we're inviting people to choose Britain as their home, then this should form part of the package of what we do going forward with migrants that make Britain their home and contribute so much. I think there is a window of opportunity, therefore, politically, to push this very positive proposal forward. But I don't underestimate the challenge. It's always difficult to get government to bend to an idea like this, but I can see more positives for the government than negatives. And as I say, Nicholas, with your assistance, with the assistance of the 3 Million and other related stakeholder groups, I think there's every chance that we can certainly build a path towards getting the recommendations of the policy listened to and potentially enacted through government policy, through government statute, and through guidance and regulations within the Home Office itself. I think on there's something that we haven't touched upon yet, and that's the honorific citizenship proposals that we have. I see that as yet another window of showcasing Britain and showing Britain for the great country. And I use great not in the Trumpian sense, I use great in the truly sincere sense We are a great country because of its peoples, because of the rule of law and the values that we have, and citizenship really embodies and encapsulates that. And so I do think honorary citizenship ceremonies that we've suggested, where the Queen or the head of government can, through perhaps the Honours Committee, nominate outstanding individuals who have contributed so much to British society to receive honorary citizenship. And I think that will certainly help push the whole momentum forward of the acquisition of British citizenship as being a win-win for both the applicant as well as wider British society.
Thanks. I'd like to bring Alex in on this specific issue. I mean, both Ryan and Alberto there are talking about how this can bridge some of the political divides, say, after Brexit, and among Conservatives, this can appeal to people who were for Brexit and want a message about Britain after Brexit, and people who've adjusted to Brexit maybe on the right when they were on the other side of the argument. I just wonder if there are any challenges that you found on the other side of the spectrum, with more liberal opinion, with the the Remain voters and the Guardian readers. This is an agenda about helping to secure rights and promote those things. Have you had people saying, "But why are you becoming British now, Alex? Surely that's an odd time to be doing it."
Yes, I mean, it's funny, isn't it? Because when I posted on Twitter, like, my citizenship ceremony photo, I think the most negative comments I got were actually from fellow EU citizens who have a different view on citizenship than I do personally. But I think this is not necessarily an issue. Like, of course, we live in a society where we debate on many of those policy issues. And I think we do need to recognize diversity of views on citizenship and try to think about, okay, what do we have in common and where can we decide on something that would be positive for people who do choose to become British. At the end of the day, of course, citizenship is a choice. Of course, I chose to apply for naturalization, and many EU citizens actually choose to do so. I think over 10% now of the EU migrant population in the UK is British as well, and the citizenship applications have been increasing, especially since the referendum. So we clearly see a trend. However, on the other hand, there are also some views that perhaps citizenship shouldn't be needed, and I really sympathize with that view, because in a way, people, EU citizens, but migrants in general, should feel secure with settled status or with indefinite leave to remain. They should feel like their rights are protected, and they should, the government has some work to do perhaps to restore some of the trust in the EU citizen communities following the referendum. But on the other hand, I also think that this doesn't mean that we cannot campaign on a more positive vision for citizenship for those EU citizens who choose to become British, but at the same time acknowledging that this is a personal decision, but that people who choose to do so actually need more information, they need a smoother process, and they need to be able to feel that the process is not deliberately deterring them from becoming British, but actually encouraging them to become British if they want to do so. And I'll just give one very simple example. When you get your EU settled status, your settled status decision letter from the Home Office, you get a PDF attachment in the email, which is not proof of status, by the way, so hence we campaign on physical documents, but it's another campaign matter. That letter that is the decision letter from the Home Office only mentions citizenship on page 3, I think, and it mentions it in the context of, by the way, there's also naturalization, you may want to click on this website. And then we get a lot of questions from EU citizens who are very confused about how to actually use settled status as a pathway to citizenship. So even in that very simple way, EU citizens could be more informed about what the pathway to citizenship is, and actually be perhaps more encouraged and more positive about this process if they actually have a more welcoming message and clear information in their decision letter. But it's one of the many changes that could be made to make the process more inclusive and positive.
Great. Now I'm going to go to some more policy questions that we've got coming in, and see if we can sort out some of these as well. A couple of things about the citizenship test and the various proposals that are made. Isabel Nicholson says she doesn't disagree with the requirement for B1 as English language being something to require, but wants to know how can the cost for ESOL be mitigated if funding has been falling year on year? What do you do about the accessibility of language? A broader question about the citizenship ceremonies comes from Tom Brooks, Professor Tom Brooks, who has written a lot about these issues and contributed to the inquiry. And he became a citizen 10 years ago and was convinced by the process that there needed to be a new test that perhaps the people who'd gone through it could feed back on. So he's happy to see the recommendations, he says, about the panel. Be very happy to be on the panel, he says, as well, that we've proposed. He would like to know how far was the Commission, this inquiry, influenced by Sir Bernard Crick's old new reports. Some of those recommendations went forward, some didn't, some have come back here. So that's something that Alberto and others might want to pick up. And then a more specific question about the citizenship test that we'll ask at the same time, or if I can group these together. What do we do about the particular case of people with vulnerabilities? Richard Chesham asks this. People with mental health problems might find that test an insuperable barrier. Now, he says at the moment, people have to show they're not only incapable of taking it now, but they won't be able to take it for the next 5 years, which can be difficult. And he knows someone who's been here 20 years and hasn't applied for citizenship because of these barriers. So there's a sort of specific group of people affected there. Alberto, can I bring you in on that set of more detailed questions?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Sunder. I think I'll start with the last question, if I may, about the vulnerable people and people specifically, as asked by Chesham about mental health. I think it's to be really welcomed that the last 5 years, and I say 5 years, really since my time as a Member of Parliament, that parliamentarians and stakeholders across policy and think tank sectors have become much more aware of the impact that mental health has on society's well-being, whether it's in the economy, in work, whether it's in education. And I think it's a very valid question. Is being a vulnerable individual itself a barrier to the acquisition of British citizenship? Well, if it is, I would certainly want to do everything in my power to remove that from being a barrier. And I think if whatever test that we have, whatever test the government adopts going forward, either through our recommendations or through some other means, that test has to have the ability for individuals that are vulnerable for whatever reason, whether it's a mental health issue or otherwise, of being able to be exempted either from sitting that test or having a test that's moderated to meet that individual's needs. So a very valid question, and one certainly that I will look further into. Now, going to Isabel's question about cost, I think the recommendation of the committee is, for example, when it comes to English language, for the state to set up relatively inexpensively a Freeview channel. Now, you could have a counter argument that you just need to switch the television on or watch programmes on subscription channels, and they're all in English. So why would you need a dedicated Freeview channel? Well, those of us old enough to remember dedicated Open University programmes late at night on BBC Two back in the late 70s and early 80s will remember that there used to be channels dedicated, that channel was dedicated, and some programmes rather were dedicated for English language lessons. They dropped off by the wayside in the late 80s. And what we're saying is we ought to consider having a Freeview channel that is exclusively dedicated to British citizenship, the acquisition and understanding of what that means, including assistance with English language. So it's an important point that you make, Isabel. However, there is a corollary, and I suppose it's this, that I think there ought to be some level of fee that individuals pay for their own training to acquire citizenship, for the very simple reason I think that demonstrates from the applicant some commitment to the process. I think there has to be some commitment there shown financially. So yes, there will. The question is, to what level is that an appropriate expectation that we should have? So yes, English language, the cost of that, cost of looking into, is something that the committee has looked at. And as I say, we've come up with one suggestion, at least on the Freeview channel, among others. Professor Tom, a belated welcome after 10 years of being a British citizen, but nevertheless, thank you for your question. You talk about how far was Sir Bernard Crick's report recommendations looked into. I'm going to defer to Jill to answer that question, if I may. But actually listening and learning from people like yourself that have gone through the citizenship ceremony, I think is very important. And if you've got further contributions that you would like to make about the report, I would greatly welcome them, and feel free to email them. But on the point of Sir Bernard's report, perhaps I could turn to Jill to answer that point.
And Jill, it would be good to hear a brief word about the cycles of the pursuit of this issue, including Bernard Crick and Dave Blunkett's work on it.
I mean, Sir Bernard Crick wrote the first citizenship test, which the Home Office had to kind of simplify for the next edition. But he's the father of the test, and he was also the chair of the advisory body on naturalisation and integration. So he has been hugely influential. The first citizenship test, you also had two options. You could either do the multiple choice test after swatting up and doing a course, but we also offered an option of ESOL courses with a citizenship element. And I think the kind of more vulnerable people are people that kind of the Richard Chesham question alluded to, often attended these courses. So Bernard Crick, immensely important, but the world has moved on since 2004. And I think the inquiry felt there was a need to review the tests and citizenship policy more generally.
But there was a commitment, I think, at the start that the ceremonies were important, that the test was important, and perhaps it's become a little bit routine. So I think we are in the spirit of it. Ryan, I'd like to bring you in on these questions about citizenship and policy and language.
Yeah, well, Jill is a mountain of knowledge, so I often defer to her. But on the issue of ESOL provision, obviously there's been a decline in the funding for that, which has been quite steep over the past decade, particularly in the as a result of coalition government cuts. We've previously talked about offering kind of income contingent loans that people could access and pay back once they're in the labour market and earning above a certain amount. So kind of student loan style scheme, which would obviously help with the upfront financing, but it would kind of satisfy Alberto's demands for a contribution from that person as well. Kind of gets rid of the sort of price barrier, but also enables someone to contribute. I mean, it's a very mixed picture, though, on who gets free access to ESOL courses or not. I mean, I've read various different documents from government, and it seems to be that they're quite unclear, because I think people who are in receipt of benefits might be eligible, and then in some local authorities it kind of varies. I don't know. Again, I'd be interested in what Jill has to say, but it's quite a mixed picture in terms of the support that people can get for ESOL learning.
Thanks, Ryan. I mean, a bit like Bernard Crick writing the first test himself, which pitched it rather high level. I'm rather keen to get hold of the programming of this channel. Actually, it could be a good thing to have so that it supports the test. I mean, obviously, you don't want too much classic comedy and the Olympic opening ceremony on an endless loop, but there's a mix of things that we could do with that channel that I think would support the aim of the tests. Now, just some more questions that are coming in. Statelessness is one of the things that is discussed in the report that is perhaps not a well-known issue, and Chris Nash is the director of the European Network on Statelessness, so he's very pleased he says, to see that this highlighted in the inquiry report, and the removal of fees for stateless children to access their entitlement to register as British citizens, and more broadly, allowing all children born in the UK to automatically acquire British citizenship would be vital steps, he says, to ending statelessness among children in the UK. And the European Network on Statelessness is gathering the evidence about stateless children and young people, and will be publishing that that next year, and wants to know how we can reform that process and support that work. So Alberto, it's a question directly to you. Do you see this something that a cross-party coalition of MPs could understand needs to be part of the citizenship reform agenda, and see statelessness as an issue of priority that the UK could address and help to address with other countries too? And there was also a question on a different issue. Andrew Young asks that British overseas territory citizens are mentioned, but there's a lot of complex categories: British overseas citizens, British nationals overseas, British subjects, and British protected persons. And of course, we've had a new positive approach to citizenship in the specific issue of Hong Kong. And I wonder whether what's happened on Hong Kong is a signal, is an omen that this agenda might be positive. So Alberto, if I could come to you on these questions of statelessness in particular, and then these other categories that obviously are important complications to our history of citizenship as a country.
Thank you, Sunder, and thank you, Chris, for that question. I think for any reasonable person, when you're confronted with the spectre of statelessness and the negative impact that has on individuals who find themselves in that very unenviable position, your heart goes out to individuals like this. And as a member of the legislature, I mean, my job in this respect is to make sure that our country observes international obligations and that has a rule of law in this field that's fit for purpose and understands the complexities of 21st century, mid-21st century society, with particularly the migration flows of people. I think there is a challenge here, to be blunt, and it's not just within my party. I think cross-party there's a bit of challenge in terms of getting this issue the prominence that it deserves. And I think it's often conflated with the stories that we see about migration generally, or immigrants coming in through channel crossings, etc. The whole issue is sort of merged into one, and it's very difficult to pick out statelessness from those other issues that people just concatenate together and just assume it's all migration. It's too many people coming into the country, and it's an issue we've got to be a bit tougher as a United Kingdom. So there is a challenge there. Because of that perception, there is a challenge to separate this distinct issue out from all the other media stories that we've been bombarded with over the last 5 years about the flow of people into or through our country. And the reason that we've made some welcome comments, I think, in the report is because we recognise that it is an important issue, and an issue that needs to get greater coverage when we talk about the issue of citizenship. So I suppose I'm trying to answer your question directly about whether there's an appetite in the House of Commons to look at this more effectively. I think there are certainly niche groups within the House of Commons that already do look at this issue. They tend to be within opposition groups, but there are some of my colleagues that have been looking at this area. And I think the report, and the reason I think it's an excellent report, the British Futures report, is precisely because it gives me that opportunity and other parliamentarians to take this specific issue of statelessness forward within the context of citizenship. So yes, there is an opportunity, but it is a challenge. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. There is a challenge, Chris, with getting the prominence that's needed for statelessness. Andrew, insofar as your question about the different categories of British subjects, British nationals, again, that was an issue that we did pay attention to. We were cognizant that there was a fast-moving, fluid situation with Hong Kong, and we took that into account in our report's findings. But what that situation has allowed, as Sunder touched on, is the opportunity for us to look at holistically other classifications of British nationals, British subjects, and ask ourselves, how can we present that opportunity to other categories of British nationals, citizenship that is, those who, and how can we ensure that there's a proper meld between our country's needs going forward in the 21st century and the needs of people that are within that category of British nationals? And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. I'm not pretending that this report has all the answers to it. It doesn't, but at least it puts it again on the agenda for us to look at and at least examine what other categories of British nationals should be encouraged to partake more in British identity, with the ultimate objective of perhaps being offered British citizenship, or at least a path to British citizenship that's fair and proportionate, meets their needs, but most importantly meets the needs of our society.
Thanks. We've got lots of practical questions about what needs to happen in reform and what can happen next, and what we can do beyond this report. So let me just highlight some of those. An anonymous question is about the barrier that is formed by comprehensive sickness insurance as a requirement. What are the alternatives to bypass that? A broader question is, for many who naturalise, it can be a long, difficult, hostile and expensive experience. And so while there are positives, it's also seen and felt through that prism. What's the panel's view on this impact? And therefore, do you need to change and improve policies such as the hostile environment to make more space for this proactive citizenship agenda? A couple more direct questions to members of the panel. One to you, Alexandra. What are the most effective ways? Phoebe Arslanarjic Wakefield asked this question. What are the most effective ways we could disseminate this information about pathways to citizenship to EU and to non-EU citizens beyond the residency letter? And a similarly practical question to you, Alberto, from Laura Taylor. Could you and your fellow MPs play an active role in encouraging people in your constituency to apply for citizenship, in encouraging the citizenship ceremonies to be held in more iconic locations, to have more gravitas? Could MPs working cross-party do this in a grassroots and bottom-up way? Might that be a way to prompt more government action? So a range of different questions there. Ryan, I might come to you next. Any thoughts about the issues that are being raised?
Yeah, well, I like the last idea in particular of MPs being involved in citizenship ceremonies when you can't get the Queen, which is obviously a great idea from British Future, but she's not going to be wheeled out for everyone. So I'm sure MPs are a good second best. Lots of ideas there, and others will speak to them. I think broadly, in terms of what the government's trying to do with immigration policy is, look for balance. So they've been quite positive, haven't they, on things like skilled migration and students. They've taken a more liberalising approach. But it strikes me that the Home Secretary has taken a stronger line on, for example, asylum applicants. So there's broadly, let's have a kind of balanced agenda. And it strikes me that citizenship and being a bit more generous with citizenship, as both this inquiry and our report has talked about, probably would fit well within that balanced agenda. And I think it's kind of for two big reasons that it might be compelling for a Conservative government. The first is that, a lot of people who were Brexiteers who are now at the head of the UK government are desperate to show that just because we're withdrawing from Europe does not mean the EU, it doesn't mean that we're withdrawing from the world. We need to have a kind of positive, global-facing, proud, positive Britain. And I think a citizenship policy which changes what happened during the last decade, where we saw a decline, and being much more welcoming of that, is a big sign and could fit with that. And the second thing I think is, I think for people on the right in particular, there's a lot of interest in what Michael Sandel, who's written a book very recently, calls contributory justice. So the idea that actually, the best way to allocate resources is how much you put in should be linked to the reward that you get out. So reward should be linked to effort. And, you know, by God, citizenship policy, people have spent years in this country contributing, paying taxes. This is the essence of contributory justice, huge amount of contribution, and, you know, which has been provided to the state, society, to all of us by these people working. The least we could do, I think, is not seek to profiteer when we reward them with a citizenship policy. And that's why we proposed in our report recently that people who've been on the front line, COVID key workers, for example, a meaningful, weighty way of saying thank you is to speed up their citizenship process and make their citizenship fee free. That, for me, is a good gesture, which is a proper thank you and fits within the realm of contributory justice, which a lot of people on the right in particular are interested in.
Alex, there are some specific issues there about the barriers and also the information. How do we get the information to people?
Yes, indeed. I will start on the comprehensive sickness insurance question, because in the 3 Million and the Young Europeans Network's campaign, Global Brits on Citizenship, we campaign for changes for everyone, you know, regardless of where people are from. We're saying this should be a more easier and positive pathway for everyone. But at the same time, there are different challenges depending on the groups of migrants we're speaking about. And for EU citizens, I think one of the key barriers is actually the lack of comprehensive sickness insurance. For those of you who don't know what that is one of the many requirements that are hard to find and hard to understand, which I mentioned before. So that is when someone is self-sufficient or a full-time student in the UK under EU rules, they have to have comprehensive sickness insurance to be a qualified person. Now, when during the Theresa May government, this requirement was scrapped for the EU settlement scheme after many of us, including here, campaigned on that scrapping the CSR requirement, because otherwise we would have seen about a third of EU citizens being actually rejected for settled status. So obviously that wouldn't have been, you know, a positive move, because previously under the old permanent residence system, about a third of EU citizens applying were rejected, and many of those because of lack of comprehensive sickness insurance. But unfortunately, this requirement does come back to bite EU citizens when they go to naturalize, because for naturalization, the Home Office does check lawful residence. And if you don't have comprehensive sickness insurance when you should have had, you are actually breaching this lawful residence. So that's, of course, one of the many issues we campaign on. We're saying that this shouldn't apply for naturalization applications, because if you think about this in a very simple way, those EU citizens got settled status. They basically, the settled status decision letter says, you know, you're lawfully resident, you have the status, you have the permanent right to reside. But then when they actually want to take the next step, after they've done their bit with settled status and they want to take the next step to become British, they're actually told, well, actually you can't, because, you know, your GP, your university, and no one else informed you that you needed this insurance during your studies in the UK. So one of the many reasons why it's unfair. I would say one thing on this, because especially if you're in a situation that you don't have, or you think you don't have the requirements needed, it's always worth seeking legal advice, which brings us back to the point that citizenship should be easy enough not to require legal advice, because in many situations, actually, people assume they need this and they actually can perhaps apply as a worker. Very simple example, if you worked part-time during your studies in a way that your work is categorized as genuine and effective by the Home Office, you may actually be able to go to justify your presence as a worker, not as a student. So yes, do seek legal advice. This, I think, bridges to the second question about outreach, and outreach is very important. Of course, now a lot of the outreach in the migration sector is about the EU settlement scheme because of the deadlines coming up very soon. However, there is also very low knowledge, I would say, amongst EU citizens, but also British citizens around citizenship requirements. And now, as we see more people getting settled status, a lot of the questions we receive as an organization and many others are about citizenship. In terms of practical solutions, I would say there are a lot of materials by organizations. Like we have citizenship fact sheets, reports, Q&A materials. We have several briefings in the 3 Million and many others. But the question is, how do you translate this information for people to actually read? Because from my experience doing outreach in Romanian communities, no one will read like 100-page like immigration booklet, and no one will read a 20-page FAQ on citizenship. So how do you make more creative material? How do you work with social media on this? How do you reach out to people? Obviously, the settled status letter could be more specific on citizenship. And the final thing I would say is that a lot of organizations now, including organizations who are funded by the Home Office, now to deal with the settlement scheme outreach and inquiries. And we have to think long term, not only about the deadline. We have to think that there will still be issues arising from the settlement scheme after the settlement scheme deadline, such as people who have to convert from pre-settled to settled status, and there will still be a lot of citizenship inquiries. So perhaps one of the questions for the future is continuing to invest in the sector, including outreach on citizenship in the longer term.
Thanks, Alex. In asking Alberto to respond to the questions we just had, I'd just like to add one other related question about this balance of complexity and accessibility of the information people need. This one's from Anita Hurrell from the Quorum Children's Legal Centre, another group whose expertise was really invaluable to us in this inquiry. She says they welcome the important report, but the challenge is a huge lack of understanding, she says, among families about whether or not their children are or can become British. So she'd like to know, how can public understanding of that be promoted? Could parents receive information when they register a baby's birth? So Alberto, I'd be interested to hear your views on this challenge of the complexity for people who are involved in this, as well as, you know, whether you can form this movement of MPs from the grassroots to march through the citizenship ceremonies.
Yes, Sunder, I'll start with Anita's question, if I may, because I suppose in our report, one of the reasons that we're proposing a return to bestowing British nationality, citizenship upon birth, is to simplify the system once again as it used to be prior to the early 1980s. So I think for Anita, if the government was to take up that recommendation that British Future and I are proposing through this report, then that would be a major achievement in helping to simplify what indeed is a very complex area. And it's complex because it's a legal right. And as with any legal rights, any responsibilities and rights that one has in a society, you know, many people from a range of different industries and sectors and fields in human society will say, well, I didn't know what the law was, or I didn't know I was able to do that, or I didn't know I shouldn't have done this. And that's the challenge you have in a mature, developed legal system. That's why we have a category of professionals called lawyers, which I belong to for my sins. But it is a real issue, joking aside. It's an issue because the challenge of communicating to an individual the rights that they have, particularly when it comes to the rights that they have as a resident and or as a citizen or as a tourist or as somebody on a study visa, whatever it might be, is itself difficult. There is no easy answer to this. I think Sunder, touching on should we have more communication at the point in which somebody's registered when someone is born in the UK, I think that, again, that's a no-brainer. It's very simple for registrars to be equipped by central government with resources to communicate the position that an individual has on birth, whether that is the right to naturalise over a period of years, or whether they are in fact British by birth, depending on their parental situation. So it is a challenge, Anita, but I hope the report goes some way in comforting you that we have looked at this and we've made some important recommendations which I think will help. We were asked 2 questions anonymously about comprehensive sickness insurance and the hostile experience. I don't think I've got much to add from what Alexandra said very helpfully. Comprehensive sickness insurance was little understood before the EU referendum. I would challenge any MP to explain to me what comprehensive sickness insurance was prior to the EU referendum. We've all had to learn what that is and the challenges that that's presented to an enormous amount of people who understandably and reasonably assumed that they didn't need any specific private policy on coming to the United Kingdom. In respect to the hostile environment, perhaps I would say this. I used to work as a solicitor for the government many moons ago, and I represented the Labour government And I had many claims brought against the Home Office as it was then. It's very easy to talk about the Home Office as this organisation that's unemotional, that's staffed by people that perhaps aren't really caring. But let me tell you, the vast bulk of civil servants that work in the Home Office are ordinary people. They work extremely hard, many of whom come from immigrant backgrounds themselves, and accordingly have an instinctive understanding of people that apply for a whole range of issues that the Home Office deals with. The hostile environment, of course, was a phrase coined up after we saw the vans going around that Theresa May's Home Secretary had instigated. I thought that those vans were wholly unnecessary, and I was very glad to see the back of them. They didn't last that long. But I do think that we should move away from using this phrase, the hostile environment, and try and see the Home Office for what it is. It's a very big organisation. It was so big that Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister, of course, split it in half, but it still remains a very large organisation, and it's very challenging for any minister of any political party to get full grips of the Home Office because it just deals with so much. But we do need to inject in the Home Office more resources, and the recommendations that we've made of citizenship, I think, go some way in giving the Home Office a much more positive reason to exist. And perhaps we could link performance indicators to civil servants that perhaps help individuals become citizens in a happy and satisfactory manner. There's some food for thought. The final point, Laura, is the question about MPs being more involved. Yes, I think that's a very important point to note. MPs are lobbied by a whole range of private and public sector organisations asking us to promote and to advertise and communicate with our constituents campaigns, initiatives, schemes, projects, rights of all sorts. And I certainly think that that would fit in very neatly with an MP's role as a constituency MP. And it is, again, something that I hope to take forward with colleagues.
Thanks, Alberto. We're coming to the end of the session because I want to give the last word to the citizens, the new citizens and the British-born citizens we met. So we'll show you a short film. Many of you here attending this event know that this can be an incredibly complex area when you look into it. I think what all of our panelists have said today is that if we got the positive vision right, we would then have the ability to maybe deal with and cut through some of that complexity and get back to what we're trying to achieve here. For that to work, this can't be the end of a process, the end of an inquiry. This has to be the start. This needs to be a focal point for the increasing, I think, civic attention, think tank attention, political attention that we could bring to this area at a moment like this. So do please stay in touch with us. Let us know your thoughts about the inquiry findings, but especially what can we do to build the salience? The idea, as Ryan and others were saying, that this really is a thing that people are looking for things to unite around in divided times, and there are lots of reasons we can agree on this. So please stay in touch with us. Thank you very much to Alex and Ryan for taking part in the panel today. Thank you very much for Jill for all of your work here. Alberto for leading this inquiry. It's not the end of the process, and do stay in touch with us. And now we will watch, if the technology works, we'll just see a short video of some of the new and old citizens that we met on our travels that have informed our views. And thanks very much everyone for attending this session today.
Another money spinning thing for the government is the way I thought of it. It seemed excessive as such.
I didn't understand the ceremony at all. I couldn't understand why people would waste their money on that. But after listening to people's opinions and how much it sort of seemed to mean to everyone, it's almost like a graduation for us. When we go to university, you get a big party at the end.
It's almost like when you're in a relationship and you want to get married to finalize it and make it official.
The citizenship ceremony, I think, is important to have it for everyone. It gives you a sense of belonging and you feel among the country that you're going to be a part of.
It was a long process. It was a lot of sweat and tears, and it was a real celebration that I attended ceremony and we celebrated at home. There was something really special about it.
To go through that and then, respect what was happening, it's quite cool, And then afterwards, when it's all over, you go for a beer and then you go, off.
In Edinburgh and in Southampton, we found a lot of agreement between new and old citizens that there is value in people learning more about the society that they've chosen to join, but that the Life in the UK test doesn't really prepare people for life in the UK. And we've learned that it does matter to people about the citizenship process that they have to go through. So it's important that we get it right.